Well, everyone, we're so glad you've joined us today by television. We know this, that God has a great plan for you. And as you know, we've been in this series, Upside Down, going from breakdown to breakthrough. What it means to adjust to your new normal, and how do you do that, and what does it look like? I'm telling you what, there's been so many things that have been happening through this series. Lives have been changing, and we're excited about how God is working in your life. As you know, we've been talking about this idea of pain without gain is a shame, and we've been looking at all these things that we have got to look at in our own life. We've talked about what it means to examine our heart. We've been looking at what it takes to examine the truth. And last week was a little brutal, I have to admit, as we looked at what it meant to examine the truth. We looked at how we had to look at our own hearts and decide whether the crisis created the problem or whether it just exposed an underlying problem that we had before it ever began. And today we're going to look at how do we recover? Now that we've looked at our hearts and we've examined the truth, how do we really recover? How do we decide when there's no going back and we have to learn from our experience and now all of a sudden we're faced with the new hardcore reality of things being different? I don't know about you, but that's one of the hardest things for me. I find myself really desiring the old life. I really struggle with this new normal and adjusting to the different things. As a matter of fact, I find myself sarcastic. I find myself denying. I find myself doing all these things to avoid what it means to be part of the new normal. But the truth is this: if we want to be the most effective for Christ, if we want to find ourselves the most effective for the ministry, we want to find ourselves more into what it takes to be in relationships with others, to influence them for the gospel, we have to embrace our new normal. Most of us in the room first want to resist the new normal, which is odd because most of us like new. Most of us like what's new. The truth is this: when we think about what's new, we oftentimes think, I love the new car smell. I love my new clothes. I love a new house. I love new. Most of us love new. But when it comes to coming out of a crisis, we all hate new, which is the opposite of what we are. I mean, think about it. You love a new hairdo. I mean, you love it when you get a new television or a new phone. Man, you should see kids when they get a new phone. So what's the difference? What's the separation from a new normal coming through a crisis and new things that you get to get? Well, most of the time it's because new things you did on purpose or they appeal to the flesh. Coming through a crisis and learning what God has for you, that's appealing to the spirit, and sometimes that's battle. Sometimes the battle between the flesh and the spirit creates all kinds of anxiety and frustration. In order for us to embrace our new normal, we've got to embrace these things, and then we're going to talk about them today. We've got to embrace our fear and our failure and our frustration and our faithfulness and our future. These 5 things we've got to embrace for us to really grasp what God has for us. This is what it takes to recover and to get into the mindset of what God would have for us to learn. So let's talk a little bit about this. What do I mean by embracing your fear? You see, a new normal means to step forward into the unknown. And the unknown always brings our greatest fears. The unknown always brings our greatest fears. When we think about the unknown, we think, I am unsure of myself. I'm not positive that I have what it takes to go that direction. I'm fearful that something out there may cause me uncomfortableness. And that's natural. All of us have feelings of fear like that when it comes to a new normal. But what does the Word say? What does the Word of God say? In 2 Timothy 1:6, it says this: "For this reason I remind you," listen to this, "fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of hands. For God did not give us the spirit of fear, but the power of love and self-control." What is this passage all about? Paul is talking to Timothy, and he's saying, listen, I don't want you to have any fear in what you're doing in your life. I don't want you to have any fear with this gift that I've given you. I don't want you to have any fear as you go forward and you proclaim the gospel. I want you to embrace it head on, and I want you to fan the flame of the gifts that I have given you. I want you to understand that this fear does not control you. You should not be fearful. You should be living in power and love and self-control. We don't have to fear a new normal. We don't have to fear a new normal. No, not at all. We want to make sure that we embrace a new normal by fanning the flame of the gifts God has given you. I want you to just think about that for a second. When you come through your crisis and you're wanting breakthrough, you're coming from this moment of breakdown, and all of a sudden, what brings you through? This embracing your fear. This idea that I'm going to apply the gifts that God has given me, the wisdom that I have gotten from him, my experiences that I have learned from in the past, and I am going to fan this flame. Not only that, but I'm going to find myself overcoming fear through power and love. This idea that my strength to have a new normal, to embrace my new normal, comes from power and love. And the last one being self-control. See, we overcome our fear this way. We overcome our fear because a new normal brings new life. A new normal brings new life, and new life changes the direction of where we are. If we see our life as our old life has died, and I'm afraid of my new life, we often miss so many things that God would have for us. We totally distract ourselves from what is happening. So throughout, again, this series, we've been asking questions as we go through it, and we're going to continue to do that today. So here's my question for you when it comes to fear, when it comes to the idea of you being afraid of what God has for you, and I'm encouraging you to say, hey, you got to fan your flame of the gifts that God's given you. You've got to live in power, and you've got to live in love and self-control. What is the question? What is the question you and I need to answer? When I think about fear, this is the answer, a question I ask. When embracing my new normal, I am going to have to face my fear of what? What is the fear you have to face? What is that fear you have to face to be an overcomer and use the gifts God has given me? What fear do you have to overcome? What is it, now that you have examined your heart and you've examined the truth, what is that fear? I've got to overcome this. This fear cannot hold me down, and this fear I'm going to attack head on with the gifts that God has given me. This is the question. This is the place. This is the first step to what it means to embrace our new normal. See, fear is the best overcome with what? A greater love. Fear is best overcome with a greater love. I want you to think about that for a moment. As you're writing down that fear and you're trying to think of how do I overcome this, it's overcome by a greater love. A greater love. Do you have greater love? Do you have a greater love for others than you do about your uncomfortable fear? Do you have a greater love for your family than you do about this new normal? Do you have a greater love for mankind than to fear? I hope that you do, because that's the first step in being an overcomer. We must overcome our fear. We must embrace our fear and fan the flame of the gifts God has given us. But the next idea is this: we must embrace our possibility to the failure to receive our greatest reward. We must embrace the possibility of failure to receive our greatest reward. The possibility of failure. Oh my goodness, oftentimes just the possibility of us failing drives our narrative. It drives who we are. You see, being in a part of a new normal brings these incredible risks of failure. When you go through life and when you have gone through a trial or a struggle, you've come through cancer treatments and you're coming out of that, you're feeling victorious that you've overcome cancer. There's always this mindset in the back of your head, but what if it comes back? There's always this mindset, what if it doesn't work? When you've come through an ugly divorce, and you find yourself completely struggling and all alone, you think, I'll never be in a marriage again because it'll probably fail as well. When we find yourself going through a crisis in life, you say, I can't do that. Why? Because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of failure. I'm afraid of it happening again. Failure controls us. Our failure to trust in God with everything about us oftentimes makes us lose out on the greatest reward. I'm just going to give you a couple examples. It's kind of interesting that one of them that Jesus used is about giving, but oftentimes our failure to be generous, our failure to give to others, our failure to love others, it causes us to miss this incredible reward. Let's read what it says in Luke chapter 6 and verse 38. It's really kind of amazing. It says this: "Given it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. this is the part I want you to think about. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. With the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. In other words, a lot of times we struggle with being generous for people. We struggle with being generous. We're fearful. We're afraid. What are we afraid of? We're afraid of failing in life. We're afraid of failing in our finances. We're afraid of failing in all these things monetarily. And God says, no. If you would just give your life, if you would just use your money to help others, I'm going to give it back to you in the same measure in which you give it. If you just give a little, I'm only obligated to give a little. If you give a little more, I'm going to give you a little more. But if you're all in, you're going to be measured with that measurement. Think about that. This reward is so great, and yet our fear of failing in our finances stops us from tithing or giving, being part of the church, or helping your neighbor out. I mean, we struggle in that world. So in order for us to figure that out, we've got to take this risk. The other thing is this: our failure to take risks oftentimes keeps us from experiencing what Jesus has for us. What Jesus has for us. There's a passage here I'm going to read in Ecclesiastes that kind of talks about what it means to be a worker. This idea of taking risks. Our failure to consider a risk, our failure to consider the risk of something keeps us from pressing on, doing better. Let's read the passage. It's found in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 8. It says this: "He who digs a pit will follow into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through the wall." Now you're thinking, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Let's just finish the next verse. "He who quarries stone is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them." What was Solomon saying? What was he trying to explain? Well, he was trying to explain this. Listen, everything you do, all the work that you may do, whether it's digging a ditch, whether it's splitting stones, whether it's cutting logs, it doesn't matter. Whatever you do in life, there's risk. There is risk involved, and you may be hurt. And the fear of this, the fear of the failure in doing something, like, I can't do that because this, or I can't do that because of this, that's not what Solomon wants you to understand. He wants you to say, listen, everything in life has risks. Everything in life has this danger of failure. Everything in life brings us this concept that we might not make it. And that's what's so wonderful, because it requires us to trust in God. It requires us to have faith in God. Instead of faith in ourselves, we have faith in God. Most millionaires today, I have at one point in their life gone bankrupt. Did you know that? Most people who have made it financially have failed multiple times. I don't know about you, but it's kind of scary when it comes to that. It's kind of scary when we think about, man, I could fail, or this is going to make me feel uncomfortable. There's a huge risk here. Well, listen, when we're coming out of crisis, when we find ourselves embracing our new normal, when we look at what God has for us, when we look at what we're going to be facing in the future coming out of a crisis, this new normal, this risk is worth it. This risk is what God has placed before you, and He wants you to embrace the risk. He wants you not to be afraid of this new idea, this new possibility of failure. And He wants you to understand that when you pursue through it, when you fight through it, you're going to receive your greatest reward. You're going to receive your greatest reward. So what kind of questions should you be asking yourself? What kind of things should you be thinking about? So here it is. To embrace my new normal, I'm going to embrace the possibility. Listen, I'm going to embrace the possibility of failing in what? What is it that's in your mind? Write it down. Write it down. When I embrace my new normal, when I'm going through my crisis, I'm going to fill in the blank. This is what I fear in failure. Maybe it's I'm going to feel like my relationships are going to fail. I'm going to feel that my finances are going to fail. I'm going to feel like my work is going to fail. In other words, there's something out there that failure is impacting the way you think, and you've got to get over it. You've got to embrace the fact that you could fail, but it's not the end of you. It's not going to make any difference with Christ, because the failure in life sometimes is what God uses to make us stronger every single day. So remember, the risk of failure always hinders us from reaching God's fullest potential in our life. And if you keep that in mind as you're going through your breakdown moment, that crisis moment, and you've examined your heart, you examine the truth, and now you find yourself looking at the possibility of failure, don't let it stop you. Don't let it stop you from embracing your new normal, because God has a great plan for you. So we're thinking about this idea of fear. We need to overcome our fear to fan a flame. We've got to overcome our fear of failure. But we also have to do this. We must embrace our frustration to change the status quo. Think about this one. We have to embrace our frustration. Most of the time, you and I, when we're facing a new normal, when we're really serious about ourselves, we find ourselves just frustrated all the time. We find ourselves in a position of frustration because we kind of like the way it used to be. And every time something changes, every time we go down this path of a new normal, the frustration causes us to be uneasy, to be reluctant, to be passive instead of going at it full force. See, a new normal changes our status quo, and so I want to ask you this question. When was the last time you did something new? When was the last time you did something new? When was the last time you came through a crisis, you came through a moment, and you decided, I'm going to do something new. I'm not going to do the same old thing. I'm going to start doing something out of the ordinary. I'm going to do something that is unexpected. I'm going to stretch myself. When was the last time you found yourself pushing yourself to become better at something? See, if we refused to look at new normals this way, if we refuse to embrace our frustration, we always just stay where we're at. We stay stuck in the mud. We become someone we don't want to be. You see, Jesus meets everyone where they are, but he loves all of them too much to stay there. And I'm afraid as Christians, we find ourselves stuck in the mud sometimes because we like the status quo. We like the way it's always been. We don't want anything new. If you're unsaved here today, I want you to know something. If you're listening by television, I want you to know that God has a great plan for you, and he doesn't want you to stay where you are. He wants you to embrace a new normal. He wants you to embrace the new possibility that he is the Son of God, because he is, and that he can change your life, and he can. And he can forgive your sins, and he will. But all it requires of you is to give your life to him. This change in status quo, this change of frustration in life. There's so much frustration going on around our world. But turning to Christ, trusting in him, this is what changes our status quo. We oftentimes find ourselves resisting the lessons we've learned in our upside down experience because we enjoy being comfortable. Some of us use this excuse, some of us as Christians. This is the verse I hear when I talk about change or doing something new. This is the one. You see, I'm just content in where I am, Pastor Ron. The Bible says we should be content in where we are, and why do I need to change? Well, that sounds really spiritual, but it really is going to prove my point. Philippians is the verse, 4:11, it says this: I have learned in whatever situation I am in to be content. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this verse about contentment, this verse about avoiding the frustration of a new normal is missing the point. The point about the verse is that no matter where you are, even when it's going through a crisis or going through breakdown or going through any trouble in life, the point is that you're content in all of that. In other words, if you want to embrace your new normal, you will be content in the change, in everything. When we find ourselves not content about the new normal, we're opposite the verse. But the problem is we always want to live back in the other moment. And God is not interested in that. Living is failing to recognize. Living frustrated is failing to recognize that the new opportunities that the new normal brings are not worth it. Living frustrated makes us bitter, not better. Living frustrated is self over others. Living frustrated is expressing your discontentment. Living frustrated is you missing out on the opportunity that God has for you. I wrote this down. I thought it was interesting. No Christian would say this. I know I can reach more people by adjusting to my new normal, but I'd rather keep on being frustrated in my new direction, the new direction that God has for me. Nobody would make that statement. Nobody would say, hey, I'm completely happy. I know that God could use me in a mightier way. I know that God could probably impact the world for him. I could be part of impacting the world more for him, but I'm gonna do the old thing. I'm gonna live a frustrated life because you know what? It doesn't really matter. No Christian says that. Christians are looking for opportunities to reach more people with the gospel unless you're completely happy with the status quo, unless you're completely happy with where you are, unless you're completely happy with being in the middle of breakdown and not learning, unless you're happy with pain and no gain. What a shame. That's where you find yourself. So here's the question. Here's the thought. To embrace my new normal, I'm going to have to stop being frustrated in what? What do you have to stop being frustrated in to keep you from being satisfied with the status quo? What is it that frustrates you? What is it that you find yourself frustrated about that's keeping you in the status quo, that's keeping you at a place where you're finding yourself struggling? Because that's what it means to embrace your new normal. That's what it means for you to be an overcomer. That's what it means for you to make a difference. I look around churches all over the country. I've been reading about them. I've been examining them. I'm examining our own church all the time. And I hope that you've been, again, examining yourself through this series, your heart and the truth. I hope that you've been doing so. But when we get down to this part, when we look down to what churches are really doing in America, when we really look at Anchorage, in all the churches we have here that are sharing the gospel and trying to live for Christ, I'm afraid that the status quo has overcome us. I'm afraid that nobody wants to take any risks. I'm afraid that fear has gripped us. I'm afraid that we are scared because we don't want to be frustrated with change. I mean, change is uncomfortable. Change is difficult. Doing something that you don't normally do because of a crisis or a situation just makes you feel really strange. But that's not what God intended for us. God wants us to embrace change. Remember, frustration only illuminates our inability or unwillingness to choose to be content. It just shows how we truly are not content in ourselves. Our status quo is just showing a whole other problem that we have. Being lazy, being a church that's not engaged in community, being a church that's not generous, being a church that's not sharing the gospel, being a church that's not standing for righteousness. That's what's become the status quo. And we need to start embracing our frustration of what it would look like for us to change, because it's going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to make us do things that we're really not ready for. It's going to make us adjust to life that God has for you, because he wants to change and radically transform your life. So we've looked at fear. We looked at the possibility of failure. We've looked at the idea of frustration when it comes to our staying in our status quo. Now let's do this. We must embrace faithfulness and make our best day today. When we want to come out of breakdown and have breakthrough, we have to embrace our faithfulness in Christ and know that every day is the new day, the best day for Jesus. So many times, I work with people who say, I remember when God was doing this. I remember when I was doing this. I remember when we did that. And they're constantly living in the past. They're constantly living back in a day that they thought was wonderful. And you want to know what? God bless history. God bless the moments in which we saw God move. But those should not be our best day. Those should not be our reward for our faithfulness. Those should not be an example of when God did it. No, we sing a song around here that says, do it again. We sing a song about do it again, how we want to see Jesus do something again. Listen, every one of us, that should be our prayer every day. Our prayer every day should be, today, Lord, I want you to do it again. Whatever it was yesterday, but today, I want to see you move. I want today to be my best day. Engaging in our new normal is shouting, Jesus, do it again. I know it's different, but do it again. I know I'm uncomfortable, but do it again. I know I have been there and done that, but Lord, do it again. Do it again. Do it again. Our idea, the concept of embracing faithfulness, the idea that we live faithful to a cause that God has called us to, should transform the way we live and think, and it will. Because we have to embrace it. We have to think today is our new day. Today is the day in which we're going to see God do greater things. And every day after that, and every day after that. If we ever get stuck thinking yesterday was a better day, we ever think, hey, the good old days, God can't use you. God finds himself struggling because all we do is give him an opportunity, give him an excuse, and we lack the opportunity. We don't even see it when he gives it to us because we're stuck in the past. Let's embrace our faithfulness. Let us never forget our commitment to what Christ has for us. I want to read this passage about this because I really think that it's going to set the tone for this concept of faithfulness. Some people at first will think that has nothing to do with what he's saying, and I want you to know there's no truth to that. Here we go. We're going to look at Luke chapter 12 and verse 16, and we're just going to see how somebody responds when they stop being faithful, when they stop and take their eyes off what God would have for them, what their true calling is. And here it is, Luke chapter 12 and verse 16. This is the parable that was being spoken. Jesus said this, and he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced a lot, plenty. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns. I will build larger ones. And there I will store all of my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, I will say to myself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for you for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be then? Whose will they be then? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God, who does not lay up treasures in heaven. Jesus often allows us in our world to be turned upside down to show us how complacent we are, how complacent we have become to what God has truly called us to do, is especially in America, when we're chasing money, when we're chasing power, when we're chasing notoriety, we're building up our barns, we're building up all the things that we think we need or we think we want, and so God just takes a moment and just destroys them in a moment. Destroys them in a moment. And he's saying, listen, what good is all that stuff? You could lose it tomorrow. The most important thing is riches in heaven. The most important thing is me. The most important thing is how you invest in your life. What should have this man done when he had all of this plenty? He should have helped out the poor. He should have given more away. He should have used it to further the kingdom. The purpose of God blessing him was so that he would bless others, not so that he would sit back and relax and chill out and get comfortable. How many of us in churches around Anchorage, how many of us have just gotten comfortable? We've accumulated some wealth, we've made some money, we find ourselves good, and so, you know what, we're just going to sit back and relax. We've been there, we've done that, now it's time for us to retire. Well, I want you to know something. There is no retirement with Christ. There is no such thing as our lives have become routine, or we want to live for ourselves, or, hey, we just want to build a bigger barn, and we don't want to invest anything in heaven. See, Jesus wants you to give your life to him. Jesus wants you to live every day Again, there's no spiritual retirement in heaven. Our lives are to be lived out to the fullest because today is the most important day for you to share the gospel. Today is the most important day for you to serve and love God. Today is the most important day for you to be faithful. If we're not careful, our complacency moves to indifference. And when that happens, the light that used to shine so bright into your life and mine is dull, is dim. A bushel is placed over it. And God's saying, listen, if you're going to come through a crisis, if you're going to embrace your new normal, you got to embrace a new day. Because why? A new normal rejuvenates our memory. It helps us to remember that God is faithful. It can inspire our greatest impact into the present and not the past. In other words, it helps us to reach the next generation with the gospel, which is what our calling is all about. It can rekindle our light. It will fan our flame. It will show Jesus and the world that we are faithful and not forgetful. So here's the question. Here's what I want you to be thinking about. I want you to fill in this blank. To embrace my new normal, I'm going to remain faithful in what? What is it that you've let up in? What is the thing that you have been faithful to, that you've seen God work, that you said, you know what, I'm just going to sit back and relax? To ensure that I'm not just building a bigger barn, I'm building a bigger kingdom. I'm not just building a bigger barn, but I'm building a bigger kingdom. What is it that you and I have to be faithful in? What is it that we have to find ourselves living for? So we think about these things. Fear of failure, the possibility of failure, the idea of frustration, the concept of faithfulness. Now the last one is this. We must embrace our future because we know what the future holds. We must embrace our future because we know what the future holds. If we want to come from breakdown to breakthrough, if we have had our life turned upside down, and we've examined our heart and we've truly been honest with the truth about what has been exposed, and we are embracing our new normal, we're going after what God has for us, we have got to embrace our future. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time right here. I just want you to read this verse, Romans 8:28. Everybody knows it, but it puts everything in perspective. The reason why we embrace our future is because we know that heaven is our home. But when we're in the midst of it, we're in the middle of breakdown, when we find ourselves in the middle of the heartbreak, this verse has to hold true. It has to be the one that we dedicate our life to. It says this in Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose. All things work together. This crisis, this new normal you're facing, you have to believe the future. You have to believe that God is going to use this for his kingdom. God is going to work good out of this situation. He is working behind the scenes. He has a greater plan. He has a plan for you and for me. He knows this, that no crisis, no event, no breakdown moment is designed to keep you down and depressed and discouraged. None, never. It's to keep your eyes on Jesus. It's to revive your thinking of what you're doing. It's to examine yourself. It's to examine your heart and examine the truth. It's for you to transform yourself into the person God would have for you. This is what God's calling is. This is why we embrace our new normal. We don't run from it. We aren't fearful. We're not fearful of failure. We're not frustrated. We're faithful. And we believe in the future. And if you do that, God will transform your life. This is our new direction. This is where we're going. This is what God has for us. Will you do so? Will you do so? Will you answer these questions? Because I believe this. I believe this. If you will, God will radically transform your life. I believe this, that you'll be on a journey down a path you will never regret. I believe this, that God will do a miracle in your life. God will do a miracle in your life. You will see the power of God like you never have before. So I want to challenge you. Embrace your new normal. Make a difference. But if you're here today and you don't know Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, if you've been watching me by television and you're thinking, I don't understand what you're saying, or I don't think any of that makes sense, but I was listening, I'm here to tell you that this concept of embracing your new normal will transform your life. But it has the greatest impact. It has the greatest impact when we give our lives to Jesus. When we tell him, I confess with my mouth that you are Lord, and I believe in my heart that you have been risen from the dead. That, my friend, is the beginning of embracing a new normal that will change your life forever. Because God wants to restore his relationship with you. He knows that you're a sinner. He knew that I was a sinner. He knew that I could not work my way to heaven. There was nothing that I could do to get myself there. I had to trust in him. I had to place my faith in the work that he did on the cross, which was pay for your sin and mine because he loved us so much. So today, will you give your life to Jesus? Today, will you turn to him? Today, would you cry out to him and say, Lord, save me. I repent of my sins. I confess that you're Lord. Today's the day. I pray that you would do so. But if you're a believer watching today, how are you doing? Are you embracing your new normal? Can you address these 5 areas that we've talked about today? Have you had some really tough questions to answer? Well, I hope that you have. I hope that you will take this moment to embrace your new normal, to embrace what God has for you in the future, for you to embrace what God would do with you to impact the world with the kingdom.
Hey everybody, Pastor Ron here. Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Here at ABT, we make a big deal about following Jesus. Make sure that you subscribe and hit our notification bell so that you don't miss any of our upcoming video content. Also, if you'd like to support this ministry, please click Donate Now. Thanks for watching.